Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global affairs through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beit-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. We're in our short summer season of episodes with women authors, discussing great books and aspects of life, past and present, that go beyond the daily horrors and absurdities of our current world. If there is one thread that is a constant throughout past and present, it's the central role of religion. And within that, regardless of your own identity and religion, is one dominant female figure, known the world over: Mary, Mother of Jesus Christ, or the Virgin, or Mary, Mother of God, which is also the title of one of the most fascinating books about this figure in both Western and world history. It's written by one of the most prominent historians of the Middle Ages and early modern times, who has written many other books and articles about the meaning of rituals and life in these periods. And she's with us today, Professor Miri Rubin of Queen Mary University, London. Very appropriate, Queen Mary. Hi, Miri. It's absolutely lovely to see you.
Good to be here.
Mary, as ever, could you start out by telling us a bit about yourself and how you became an historian and why you decided on this period, and of course, how you came to be writing about Mary?
Sure. Where does one begin? But I was just very fortunate, really, to have a fantastic start in my historical education. I should say that before I did history, I did a year of chemistry when I was growing up. So that's making these choices in the 70s. It seemed that if you were good both in sciences and in the humanities, it was still more extraordinary for a girl to be, I use the word girl advisedly, to be, in the sciences somehow. It was more exciting. It was more unusual. So my teachers encouraged me to do that. And I went to university, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I did a year of chemistry. And then came our war of 1973, the Yom Kippur War, and it made all life seem very different after it. And I just decided I needed to do something else, and I chose history, still at Hebrew University, and I just had an array of the most extraordinary teachers there. And it was sort of a good structure of the course, because in the first year, they just threw us into a bit of everything: ancient history, medieval history, early modern, etc. And I simply had the most charismatic and wonderful teacher of the Middle Ages, through a very much a set piece of that period, studying the Crusades. So this teacher, Ron Barkai, whom I think you know, Ilana, he taught it in a way that for the late 70s was really quite extraordinary. That is to say, to see it as an encounter rather than just a European Christian phenomenon. We looked at theories of just war. We looked at Europe. We looked also at Islamic ideas. We looked at the Quran. We looked at chronicles translated from the Arabic and so on. He was really quite an extraordinary pioneer in terms of understanding that Europe cannot be understood as a Christian entity on its own. And he was just deeply charismatic, and I decided I wanted more and more of that, and ultimately came to Cambridge to do a PhD. It's quite common that people who showed promise in Israel at the time, were encouraged to find scholarships and to fund themselves in centers of excellence outside Israel, outside Little Israel. And so we did, and I came to Cambridge, where again, I was extremely fortunate to have a wonderful supervisor, Christopher Brooke, and worked on the social history of the Middle Ages. I looked at poverty and charity provision for the poor. And I was very much inspired already in Jerusalem, but tried to realize it ever since, really, by a school of history associated particularly with France, called the Annales School, which is a school of history that aims really to look at long-term movements, at deep concepts, not just kings, queens, battles, bishops, and revolutions, and so on. And really, it sort of stayed with me. And And it's really interesting because whenever you write, so I wrote this PhD and it turned into a book. But what's interesting is that every time you write a book, you think, oh dear, this is such a great idea. I'll never have another as good. But somehow, 2/3 of the way through a book, I find you, just something comes organically out of it that takes you on to your next project. And so it was ultimately to the book about the Virgin Mary that you kindly mentioned. But what was also really exciting about being a young academic or rising in the 80s through my PhD in Cambridge, it wasn't quite there yet, but it was a beginning of the time of women really entering and leading and beginning to lead in large numbers. Of course, there were always pioneers and there were always significant role models, but it just became after the 60s and 70s with feminism and really the breakthrough of the new histories and women's history. By the 80s and then the 90s, it was simply there in numbers. And it was possible to build really strongly on that and to both seek role models, but also provide them. And that's really been the story of, I think, of my life in academia.
Right. We were lucky enough to have Mary Beard with us a few weeks ago, who was talking about
Nice.
being a pioneer in Cambridge, and that, possibly for the first decade of her tenure there, she couldn't find a voice as a woman because she was the only woman there. When she did speak at meetings, she realized she was using a male mode of discussion. So I think you really were amongst pioneers, all of you, and it's really quite fascinating how this comes about and how it changes, I think, the world of history. There's no doubt about it. Really, why did you want to write, though you say it came organically out of your first book, nonetheless, writing about Mary is a very challenging, I would have thought, route to take. You write the most fascinating history of her, but what was so attractive to you about this character?
Step back just a tiny bit for some background there. So by the time I did the Mary book in the noughties, I had written a book about the really important central ritual of Christian religion, well, definitely Catholic religion, which is the ritual of the altar, the Eucharist, the Mass, which is a ritual that in the Middle Ages people were only obliged to attend once, but meaningfully, just before Easter. But it encompassed the whole Christian story because it was the belief that you can approach through the Mass, you can actually become one with your saving God. That is to say, through the offering from the hands of a priest of a piece of bread, well, unleavened bread, more like a sort of cracker, which through his blessing and without changing shape at all becomes Christ's body, the very historic body of hundreds and thousands of years ago. And this is a quite bold idea, and many found it very difficult to believe. But it was at the core of the tremendous promise of, not only the sacrifice at the origins of Christianity, but also the ongoing possibility of connecting. So it's extremely central from about the year 1150 onwards to not only to the work of theologians who have to figure it all out. How does this work? How do we teach it? But also to people's experience, the build up towards it, the even going just to church and seeing the Mass celebrated every day, even if you don't partake. Absolutely central. And what I discovered through studying this, is that there's a subset of stories about the Eucharist, about the bread itself, that involve Jews. So, my ears pricked up, as it were. It was quite interesting. What are the Jews doing at the heart of Christian religion? And I found that the Jews were good to think with about this subject because the Jews obviously didn't believe it and rejected it. So by telling stories about Jews rejecting and being punished, you could convince Christians that they as Christians really ought to believe better because they're not Jews and they're proper Christians, sort of thing. So the Jews are often used as a teaching device, as a pedagogic tool, as it were. By telling a story about what the Jews do, you get Christians to want to do the opposite if everything works well, as it were. And you may wonder how I came to write a book about this, me being, Jewish and not an observant Jew even in a big way. So the whole religion thing I saw through a sort of anthropological gaze, which is again something very, very characteristic of the type of history that I chose to do then, and which was being done then very fruitfully. In fact, my great colleague, admired colleague, Peter Burke, the cultural historian, once said to me, "Miri, you are an anthropologist of medieval religion." And in a way, he was right. He was using tools of anthropology, but also I had that somewhat sympathetic outsider's view onto it all. So out of looking at that, then I entered into this whole world of normative religion with all its complexities in the Middle Ages. How is it taught? What reaction, what pushback does it get from ordinary people who just ask really simple questions like, in the case of the Eucharist, come on, if it looks like bread, how come it's not bread? Sort of thing. But then the Virgin Mary, she's a woman, she had a kid, and she's a virgin. That doesn't make sense. I mean, people were asking these questions. They were not dupes. They were asking these questions. And if they overcame these doubts, it's really through faith or through fear. So once I've explained how I was at the heart of the symbols of Christian religion and the way they were taught and the way Jews were often inserted into them, then Mary became a very, very attractive figure to study, to understand, because I discovered in the course of all that Mary was, again, believing all of that about Mary and bringing the Jews in, who totally reject, who think it's ridiculous, who think it doesn't stand to reason, who deride, in some polemical texts, even say quite rude things about the Virgin Mary and the idea of her body. Yeah. Sometimes extremely graphic and extremely misogynistic in the course of heated polemical exchanges. If that's what the Jews believe, then a good Christian should believe and accept Mary for her purity and not deride and accept. So again, I found this dialectic of the medieval Jew imagined for the purpose of making better Christians. But of course, once you start studying Mary, and there's the whole dimension of course, the mother, the woman, her centrality. What does it mean in a patriarchal world to have this type of figure? Mary, of course, ultimately becomes this global figure, as you said, a figure known to everyone, even in countries that aren't Christian, just through the power of imagery, through the power of empire, through the power of mission, through the power of the travel of images, and also through the fact that every religion that I know has female deities or female saints or revered women. That doesn't mean that women are treated well, but it does mean that the feminine is almost, it's just sort of utterly necessary for the making of the religious narrative. And definitely in Christianity, which is a religion of incarnation, it's all about the most extraordinary idea that God becomes a man, that the divine becomes human in all these extraordinary ways. So she is so central. She is, well, basically it's impossible to imagine Christianity without her. So she seemed to be a very worthy subject for study.
And your book undoubtedly explores that in many ways. But for me, one of the things that comes out is, well, apart from the fact that, as you point out right at the beginning, nobody really knows who she is. There's very little historical fact about Mary, but she herself has no agency. This is a woman who is a vessel that you then pray to, that in the hope that somehow this vessel will bring you good things. But her role, no matter throughout the incarnation, and you follow it beautifully from the very beginning, 2026 years ago, the early Renaissance, but you also have a lovely afterword bringing her up to date now. But as I say, this is a woman with no agency of herself, really. It's a very curious contradiction.
It's complicated. That is to say, she's everything, but we can only seek agency if we think of her as a human. If we think of her as a symbol, if we think of her as an idea, as we think of her as an absolutely necessary part of one of the greatest stories ever told, then we don't feel a lack. We just are amazed at the extraordinary creativity around her. And just to demonstrate how necessary she was, if we go back to the Gospels, she's mentioned very little. I mean, some of the evangelists really aren't interested very much. Some offer her in the context of genealogy in order to establish who Christ was, and that indeed he has a genealogy that takes him back to the house of David, so he is truly the Messiah, and so on. But, and really essential questions about her are left untouched in the first century, which is a century of most of the fundamental Christian writings. By the second century, and in Greek, and it exists in a papyrus, it still is with us, somebody felt the need to write up her biography, the sort of prequel, as it were, the prehistory of, because it was so essential to the idea of Jesus, which was slowly spreading around the Eastern Mediterranean, right? So essential. And needed explaining, particularly it needed explaining to Jews who might become Christians, who many of whom, of course, became Christians. It needed explaining also to pagans, to people who had no Jewish background, but could become and did become Christian. So the story had to become much more robust as to who is this woman. And what she's given is that biography, with answers to all the questions that the Gospels leave absolutely open and unanswered. And there it's explained that actually, she is a mother worthy of her son. That is to say, she comes from a good Jewish family, dare I say, sort of a noble family. Not that that really existed, but a fine, virtuous family, that she was born to elderly parents who could not conceive, and she was born in a way miraculously through divine intervention in answer to prayer. So again, her own conception, as it were, had touch of virtue and of the divine. And that also brings into the picture her mum and dad as holy figures in the Christian story, but also that her own body, her own self, it remained pure and intact. One version of the story, and all these stories coalesce from the second century, but they're translated into all the languages that become languages of Christians, be it Armenian or Georgian or Ethiopian or in that region. And then all sorts of questions about her body, because of course the body is essential here in terms of purity. And her foot never touched the ground. She was offered to work in the temple in Jerusalem. She was a very, very fine, she did the embroidery in the temple, and she did the best embroidery of all the other girls in the temple. And that she had this transition from temple, then to betrothal, then to some sort of relationship we may call marriage. Obviously, the main relationship with an older widower. Again, this is all stuff that's not in the Gospels, right? In order to create like a sort of a cordon of purity around her, she's married to a man where it's implied that there would not be sex there. Indeed, he's so astonished when she does get pregnant with this child, and has to be convinced against his initial reaction that it wasn't through adultery, that it was actually through the Holy Spirit. So all these questions are answered because it's understood that she's a story. She's a story. This is what people ask. So if you're sitting around and you're a preacher in some town in the second century and you're starting to tell people about this extraordinary story that happened in Jerusalem that's coming our way, that will bring salvation, that he may return very soon, sort of thing. So who were his parents? So who was his mother? So how come who bore this God-made man? So in that sense, it maybe doesn't have agency in the sense of human agency of choices, because in a way, all the choices are made for her. But as a symbol, it's just so powerful. And throughout the history, and that's what the book is really about, is all the attempts of Christians, obviously intellectuals, men mostly, but not only, who build up her figure. And by the Middle Ages, of course, there are women with some agency, albeit seen as vessels, that is, mystics and various type of religious enthusiasts whose writings or his visions have been written down, and they all contribute to this story of Mary. And Christian education is not imaginable without stories about Mary that, again, in a way, like with the Jews, the stories about Mary teach you how to be a good Christian. And it's not denied that she was of Hebrew origins.
Yeah. So that's why the relationship, exactly. And you have another book, which we may come to, about the relationship between Jews or the image of the Jew in medieval history. But just to carry on with Mary, I was also very fascinated. First of all, like with many issues of that time, a lot of it is dependent, as you suggest and allude, I would have thought, on illiteracy. You have to rely on the stories that you're told, as opposed to going to read something and decide for yourself or whatever. Literacy very much changes that. But I love the way you trace the iconography of her, that she grows into this image that there was no image before. Partly on the Jewish side, then, one of the main core issues is, of course, that, sort of, thou shallest not make any image of God. So, one of the first things that you're crossing is this idea that there is an image of God, Jesus Christ, and then the mother of God. Though I was fascinated again by the way you point out that when it spreads to Egypt, then the original ISIS, not the nasty terrorist group, was, of course,
Death cult, yeah.
Yeah, the mother of fecundity, the most bountiful figure possible, and etc., etc. So I do think that these evolutions are so fascinating in so many ways, and that you have to, her image, her what she looks like turns into this central thing. Is there an evolution? Can you explain to our listeners maybe the evolution of her image? Because there wasn't one before.
Yes, definitely. I mean, first I'm going to take you up on the term illiteracy, because 2 days after the death of Dolly Parton, when we're recording this, we're very attuned. She reminded us that people can be illiterate like her father was, but they can also be extremely intelligent and creative through other forms of expression. In the case of her family, music, of course. So the fact that most people did not have the skills of reading and writing, you're absolutely right. And they depended on the mediation of, obviously, priests, but also figures in the community that did have access to reading and writing. So there was sort of communal sharing of stories, but also storytelling. Storytelling, as you said, is just so powerful, and passing stories on through generations, where again women were really, really important. And of course, although people always think, and this is sort of part of the Protestant critique of medieval Catholicism, is that, it was all in Latin, people didn't understand. No, the spoken languages were used throughout, absolutely, when dealing with communities. Not the ritual remained Latin, that is true. But so there is all of that. But of course, in that context, in that sort of society, imagery was absolutely essential. And as you say, again, there is no legacy here. Christianity built everything on the Jewish Hebrew Bible, but imagery it could not inherit. So wherever Christianity went, and indeed wherever it still goes, it adapts mostly the existing codes of beauty, of femininity, or whatever. It's enough just to remind ourselves of the extraordinary tradition of, say, Ethiopian Christian art, which is, again, very ancient, where Mary is absolutely has black skin. It's obvious you build into what you have locally, what is expected locally, and so on. But of course, in the Eastern Mediterranean, if we think where Christianity was born, you have extraordinary classical traditions and ancient traditions of various kinds, like the one that you mentioned, Isis being this fecund goddess that was loved around the Mediterranean, and hundreds of temples to her just in Egypt, as you mentioned. So we literally see how, with the spread of Christianity and the Roman Empire becoming a Christian empire in the course of the 4th and into the 5th century, you do see this replacement. You literally see Isis temples being rededicated as temples to Mary. And in the Egyptian context, a very daring image survives in some papyri to start with, of Mary actually offering her breast, her bare breast to the child, which is absolutely the Isis image to her son. But that doesn't happen in other places. So the toleration for a bare breast in the public domain, as it were, it exists in that Egyptian Isis context. It doesn't exist everywhere. So it's very rare to see an actual bared breast in that period. It's back in later on. So wherever Christianity goes, and this of course also follows for the early modern, be it Mexico or Peru or the Philippines, wherever Christianity implants itself and converts large numbers of people, it adapts and adopts local concepts of beauty, of harmony, of aesthetics, etc. And also because it's converting people, and these are the local artists, these are the local materials as well, literary materials and colors, available pigments even in these places. So really what I found in the course of working on Mary, that she became just the surest and most helpful guide to even taking a more global approach to Christianity and how that operates. Yeah.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And by the time, she becomes absolutely central, because we're just going to jump ahead because we want to get to some of your other books too. But we're going to jump ahead to she becomes so central to building up the image in Christianity of a benevolent and caring, not just religion, but culture. And then it's rejected in many ways in the Reformation, the Christian Reformation. Can you explain that, why Protestants decide to view Mary differently?
Yes, it's a very good question. And even the word rejection is one that one has to use with care, although it's largely true. So if we're reminded of the main thrust of Luther's critique of the Catholic Church, is that it totally lost its way by forgetting the Bible, forgetting the base, God's word in a way. Yeah, God's word. And it got engaged in what were profit-seeking and otherwise ill-intended ways of encouraging people to be tied to the church through all sorts of beliefs that are absolutely unverified in terms of the Bible, be it pilgrimages, be it the cult of images. Indeed, the very images that the Christian church built up over 1,500 years, the very images we just discussed, get rejected for the reason, again, that we just discussed, that the Bible does not encourage, it discourages the making of images. Why are all churches full of images of human beings, as it were? And the critique, ultimately, the catchword is sola scriptura, only scripture, only faith as well. You are your own priest, and you have the Bible as your guide, and that's all you need. So if you do that test, Mary is there. So Luther, for example, writes a fantastic translation of the Magnificat, hymns that involve Mary, but in the roles that the Bible, that Scripture assigns to her, not everything else. So for Lutherans, it will be not rejection, but scaling down dramatically of what was that whole world of Mary cult, pilgrimages galore, thousands and thousands of shrines, images, relics, the remains of her birthing belt, the remains of the milk of her breast that she sent down to earth. I mean, all of that was anathema. Mind you, it was also lampooned by Catholic reformers, not just by Protestants, like Erasmus wrote absolutely coruscating critiques of pilgrimage in his own style of tremendous sort of, satirical verve. But Luther was bested by other Protestant leaders who went much further than him in the rejection of all this materiality of medieval religion and the imagery as well. So Luther, by the end of his life, looks old-fashioned and quaint and almost nostalgically Catholic, He is that hinged figure, all necessary, but others went much, much further, where truly the Virgin Mary is not only rejected, but derided, where there is polemic, actually repeating a lot of the sort of things the Jews said about Mary as well. Doesn't stand to reason. It's not in the Bible. It's all this sort of thing. So it was a massive cultural transition. It broke Christianity's house into two, sort of thing, as one historian put it. And Mary, therefore, in some parts of the world, is adored, and that's the appropriate word, adored literally, like a goddess herself, and in others doubted, and in others totally rejected. But I should say that even in Protestantism, it was really, really hard to let go of some of the beauty and some of the mercy and some of the just visual and material heritage. I mean, think of Queen Elizabeth of England. She really styled herself as a sort of virgin queen, borrowing tremendously from Marian iconography and all the good stuff around virginity, as it were, that had developed over the centuries. So it's extremely interesting in that way, yes, but the more sort of Calvinist or beyond have nothing of that, except that Mary is always very useful as a figure to enlist women in religion, in talking about exactly sort of mercy, support, care. You wanted women to continue performing these type of caring activities that arise also from a religious motivation. So Mary doesn't disappear, but she is largely diminished in large parts of Christianity from about 1500, yeah.
Well, as you point out in your introduction, somebody brought her back big time, ironically, undoubtedly, but probably the most important pop star cultural symbol for women in the 21st century is Madonna. But I think she is, as I say, on the one hand, very serious about that. And she, I think, herself is a Catholic. But equally, one of her most famous songs is Like a Virgin, touched for the very first time.
Yeah. It's people in the tradition who can use it in all these type of rejecting or creative or other ways, absolutely. And it was seen very shocking, but as you say, it's a total vestige of the culture in, I think it was Detroit, where Madonna grew up, and Catholic Italian American family, and that's what was there. I mean, what's really striking in the United States and in the Americas in general today is people of obviously, Hispanic culture is deeply, deeply imbued with Marianism, and the cult that is the most, or the version of Mary that's the most pervasive, both visually and in terms of rituals, is the Virgin of Guadalupe, who's a very interesting figure. It's in a way related to a vision by an indigenous and Amerindian converted to Christianity in the 16th century, who had a vision of Mary at a place that had previously been, in fact, a center of cult for an indigenous goddess. So you see all this hybridity around the figure. In fact, a lot of the most exciting work about early modern global music and imagery, etc., in the religious domain is around these issues of adaptation, hybridity, what some people call appropriation, others would call creativity. And it comes from both directions. That is to say, Jesuit missionaries will knowingly approach, say, I don't know, the Huron, indigenous in the Great Lakes area in the 17th century. They will travel, through the snows and utterly reach these people and try to explain Christianity with an image of Mary. We have evidence of Father Marquette with a silk print of Mary, which is nice and light, and he can fold it in his baggage while he's traveling in these really difficult conditions. And he pulls it out and he starts telling the Christian story. So it comes both from those who will conquer and convert, but it also comes from indigenous people who have to make sense of this new world of, indeed, conquest and mission, and create their own forms of adaptation and bringing together. And we mentioned earlier Mary and the ethic of care. And it's so interesting to see Mary as an icon to LGBTQ communities, to actually in California, an icon on the banners of those marching for migrant rights or agricultural workers' rights, etc. So she is, really endlessly useful in that side of the caring, the loving, and ultimately it's the maternal, and even more ultimately, it's the feminine. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the feminine. It's absolutely fascinating. I could carry on talking about this for a long time, but I have another question to you, though you alluded to it right at the start. Amongst your many books, you also wrote a short introduction to the Middle Ages. And tell us a bit about that, but also, do you feel the Middle Ages are still relevant today in the way that, for example, when I was discussing it, then, we can learn so much from ancient times. What is it about the Middle Ages that remains with us? And what is it about the Middle Ages that better not?
Yeah. So I'm sitting here in Cambridge where I live. In a way, this university town is unimaginable without that heritage. It's a story of, total continuity with a heritage it was built upon over the centuries. So there is that element. If you're going, in Europe itself, of course, just obviously the European heritage itself, the fabric is everywhere. The institutions are everywhere, be it parliament, be it the university, as I say, be it the guilds, which transform themselves into societies that still exist today. So there is the element of continuity and heritage. There is also the element of that which is actually not like us, and we want to think through in order to find out who we are. So I have fantastic, PhD students who look deeply into, say, the question of consent and sexual violence and rape, say, in the 14th century. I can think of one. That is totally part of her own engagement with violence against women in the here and the now, and the thinking of the boundaries and the thinking about how the law is used or not used. We need a foil. We need stuff to think with. As I said before, like the Christians needed the Jews, we all need that. Is how we learn. That is how we figure things out. It's confronting the less familiar in order better to understand that confronts us on a daily basis. So there is that as well. And there is something to be said. So that is true of any encounter with the difference. That is why we have to understand other cultures and other places. But there is something very poignant and very to the point when you are dealing with a culture that in some sense you feel connected to. So this is those of us who see ourselves as associated with the European culture through heritage or in all sorts of other ways. It's natural for us to engage there. But for example, me as a Jewish person, I also want to engage with the Jewish tradition at its different stages and to see, these are depths of thought and depths of sentiment and depths of artistic expression. I say some of it can inform my life. Some of it makes me even surer that I want to reject, if you see what I mean. So it's that constant encounter and the constant ferment of thinking of other places and other times. I think that is why the Middle Ages. I mean, I hate that word. I really hate that word, but that's the word, you know. And when Oxford University Press asked me to do a volume in, I think it's over a decade ago now, in their amazing blockbuster series, very short introductions to something, it allowed me just to reflect on all of this. And I explain in the introduction to it that the Middle Ages is a term that was created by Renaissance people who wanted to reject, the last, 1,000 years or so. It's that middle period between us and antiquity where that's serious, we're serious and we are. And it was a totally an act of marketing by Italian, humanist sort of intellectuals from the 14th and 15th century, but it's stuck. And I try in various ways to obviate it by, say, when I organize my modules at Queen Mary, it's from 1400 to 1600 or 1300 to 16, but we still are very, very much caught up in it. And the strangest thing is that last month, in the course of trying to purify their curriculum, the state of Texas published the recommended readings for children from K to 12, that is, the whole curriculum of a child's life at school, what they read in every year in order to be rounded individuals, as it were. And at some point, I think at 16, they recommend a few chapters from my very short introduction to the Middle Ages. I think the people who chose it, yes, in Texas, Texas schools, all Texas schools, 16-year-olds. So I think they probably thought, the Middle Ages, it's safe. It's European. It's kosher, dare I say. But what they'll find is that it's feminist, that it's worker-oriented, that it's environmentally oriented, that it's a lot about Jews and Muslims too. They'll have a bit of a surprise, but maybe for sure they'll have an education. So that's quite good.
I think I have one last question because I know that we both of us have to rush away, which is such a pity because we're just getting started. But
it's been fun.
I think that what I find really fascinating, which, as you just alluded to very briefly, can you explain, I think, how Islam comes to Europe and how much it has also been part of culture in Europe throughout its existence? Because I think there's this myth that it was in Spain, there was the Reconquista, we got rid of Islam and that's it, kind of thing. Whereas I don't think that's true at all.
We are constantly learning more and more because just the last sort of 20 years has seen an explosion of research and very fine research. It's comparative and that seeks indeed Islam in Europe. There's a wonderful, big funded project called, I think it's called the European Quran. And amazing group of scholars, international group of scholars is looking at, how does the Quran inform European life? And you can imagine that the right absolutely hates it and they often get attacked by, So we can't dismiss the fact that indeed, as you say, Islam literally was in Europe and Islamic polities ruled Iberia, most of Iberia, from the 8th century until the 15th century, parts of it, diminishing parts because of the process by which Christian rulers conquered more and more parts of Iberia and brought it under Christian rule. But to say that they brought it under Christian rule doesn't mean that Islam disappears, because of course the population in some regions is majority Muslim or large minorities of Muslims. They're there. The culture, the architecture, the names of things, the sciences that had been encouraged and developed from medicine to astronomy, etc. So the fact that Christian polities rule increasingly larger parts of Iberia after, say, the year 1000 does not mean that Islam culturally, materially, and in the form of, Muslim people disappears. There is an attempt to fix that, of course, in the very late 15th century by mass expulsions. expulsions of people who had not converted to Christianity, who were resisting, as it were, just as there was the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. The expulsion of the Jews. So there are attempts to engineer the pop, but it's because the Muslim presence is so strong. But there's another type of connection, so two other very important types of connection, just to say. First of all, there is the Islam of the imagination, thinking about Islam. This is particularly the case from about the 12th century on. Texts about that polemicize with Islam or engage with Islam. And that's another area of contact, intellectual contact, Islam on the mind, as it were. But probably the most sort of enduring and, to my mind, very interesting is the actual flow and contact through trade and through movement across the Mediterranean and ultimately into Asia itself. And we may call that contact what Europeans call the Crusades, these movements of hostile Europeans to what is the Holy Land, establishing kingdoms, being rebuffed, being kicked out, coming again, this sort of thing. But the constant flow of pilgrims to what are, Muslim countries, basically, the constant trade with North Africa, with the Eastern Mediterranean, the taking of captives in that space, the exchanges that follow in order to redeem and free those captives. There is constant contact between Christians and Muslims in the Mediterranean space and beyond. And that is something that it doesn't just start, everybody knows, with the Ottoman Empire. It's there for absolute centuries. Europe depends on Muslim countries to travel through and to access the spices they love, the dyes they love, the silks they adore, and a whole lot of knowledge too. In 3 minutes, it's impossible to do justice to the presence of Islam in European culture, but I've at least pointed to a few directions, I hope.
You absolutely have, and you've given us some wonderful insights into Mary, Mother of God, first of all, but also into the whole period, and much more to discuss. So we'll be delighted to have you back. Thank you very much, Miri.
Thank you.
Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, family, enemies, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram at Women Leaders Podcast and on ELN, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beitel, together with my friend and producer, Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very, very soon with another great conversation.